In the previous video, we looked at the 7 problems we have with viewing and understanding colour, and I somewhat tongue-in-cheek mentioned that colour only exists in our brains. Well, that may well be so, but there are ways that we can in fact measure and define colour that is independent of individual preferences and ways that we see colour. And to look at how we started measuring colour, we need to go all the way back to the 1600s and Sir Isaac Newton. He was the first person to start to look at how we can measure colour. And he came up with the concept of primary and secondary colours and put them together in what we might now recognise as a very early version of the colour wheel. And if we take that early model of Isaac Newton's and refine it, we now look at something we're all familiar with, which is the colour wheel, and this represents all of the colours that we can see. Now, not everyone can see all of these colours, but this is the theoretical model of how all colours can be seen. And about this time, people started to talk about also about concepts of colours and how they related to each other. So we have colour harmonies, colours that don't work together, complementary colours and so forth. There's a whole lot of material on colour theory, but basically it's about how certain colours seem to work together better than others. But moving on from Sir Isaac Newton and the colour wheel, we started later on to create models that would represent how we can measure and define colour. And using the colour wheel as an example, the next most sophisticated model is a thing called the Hsb Color Model, which you might also know as HSL, hue, saturation and luminance or brightness. And basically all they've done then is take that colour wheel and introduce a third dimension, which is the vertical axis that takes us from black to white, and then from the centre lowest saturation to greatest saturation. And so this was an early attempt at creating a model that we could use then to measure and define colour. And then moving on from the Hsb colour model, we come to something a little bit more sophisticated that many people will also be familiar with, and that is the LAB colour model, which is lightness and then the A and B axes. And to think about how we can define colour this way, we just need to look at how we understand how we can define space in a three-dimensional world. If you go back to your high school mathematics, you would have remembered we can define in a two-dimensional space any point using an x and a y coordinate. So any point within a two-dimensional space can be easily identified by two simple numbers. So if we take that one step further, we can move into three-dimensional space, and instead of just the x and y axes, we have another axis called the z-axis, which then defines the third dimension. So in a three-dimensional space, we have x, y, z coordinates, which give us a point that can be defined. So going back to our LAB colour model, we have the same thing. We have the A axis, red to green, the B axis, which is yellow and blue, and then the vertical axis, which is the luminance axis, goes from black to white. So looking a little further at the LAB colour model, we can see that it is actually a theoretical model that describes colours in three-dimensional space, and we'll see that at about the middle level of luminance is where we can have the highest saturation levels, and as we go brighter with higher luminance and as we go lower with less luminance, our range of colours is reduced, and that matches pretty much how human perception works. At lower luminance levels we cannot see much in the way of colour, and then as we get into higher luminance values, our brains also and our eyes cannot read the most intense colours. So this is a theoretical model that tries to put into mathematical terms how vision and colour work together. And being an independent model, we can actually define a colour with a set of numbers, and that is independent of any device or machine or whatever it is, and these colours are totally independent. And how that relates to photography, we then start to look at how we have colour spaces that are based on this LAB model that define how various devices can capture and display color. And let's have a look at that next. So now we're going to have a look at some color spaces that are based around devices and things we're familiar with. And we're using a program called ColorThink, which is a way of displaying in three-dimensional space the various color spaces that we're familiar with. And what we're going to start with first is we're going to have a look at the one that most people are aware of, and that is Srgb, small RGB color space. And you'll see that on this graph we have an L axis, the lightness axis, and we have an A and a B axis. And this is actually a three-dimensional model that allows us to inspect the range of colors that are available to us. So let's just look at this from the top down, which is the way most people are familiar with seeing colors. And on its own, Srgb color space looks reasonable, but it was designed around the lowest quality display devices that were available back in the 1980s and 90s. And it's really only suitable for as a working space for things that are going to be displayed on the web. And even then, a lot of the better quality monitors out there are capable of displaying a wider range of colors. So moving up from Srgb, let's have a look at Adobe Rgb, which is another color space, and I've made this semi-transparent. So if I make it solid, you'll see that it's a bigger color space, and it quite comfortably encompasses all of the colors that are within the Srgb color space, and quite a lot more, particularly when it comes to looking at in the green area and a bit in the purple, reds and yellows. And certainly in terms of overall brightness, the brightest colors are about the same and the darkest colors are about the same, but the colors in the area where that we're most familiar with working in our images, Adobe Rgb offers a significant greater space than Srgb. So let's move ahead now to the one that most people would be familiar with, which is our working space in Adobe Lightroom, and the preferred working space for images that are going to be printed or extensively edited, and that is ProPhoto color space. And I've also made this semi-transparent. If I make it fully opaque, you'll see that it's a much larger color space. So I'll just drop that luminosity back on that so that we can see, and I'll turn off Srgb, and we can see that ProPhoto color space compared with Adobe Rgb offers a significantly larger color space to work with. So it encompasses pretty much the maximum range of colors that human vision is capable of seeing, and that is people with extremely good color vision can see. And so when we're editing our images and working with our images, we want to work with the largest color space possible so that we can encompass the greatest range of colors. And some people think that you should be printing, or some online printing bureaus ask you to send the images in Srgb color space, which is, if you're dealing with someone like that, change immediately because they don't know what they're talking about. Srgb color space is not at all suitable for printing, and what I'm going to do now is turn on a color profile that is for a Canson platine paper, which is a commonly used high quality art paper. And what I will do is I'll make that fully opaque, and you'll see that firstly it fits comfortably within the ProPhoto color space. I'll turn Adobe Rgb off so that if we're working in a color space like ProPhoto, we know that all of the colors that we can see can be printed. In fact, we can see colors that can't be printed, but that's handled in the rendering intent when we go to print, and we'll cover that more in a few videos on printing and preparing for print. But if we were to say, let's get out of ProPhoto color space and get back into Srgb color space, all of a sudden we can print colors that are way outside. When I get the right one turned off, and I'll make the Canson paper profile semi-transparent. With Srgb color space, it can't even represent colors that the paper can print. See all of these colors here and down here? these are colors that Srgb can't even understand or display, and yet we can print these colors. So if you're working with a bureau that wants you to send images in Srgb color space, they're not really making the most of what's available for printing your fine art images. So a ProPhoto color space offers the widest range of colors available and much more range of colors than Srgb, which is really, again, only for images that you might display on the web. And while we're looking at a 3D color model, let's have a look at what sort of colors your display can typically handle. If we go back to our old Srgb color space, which most people think is what your monitor can display unless you're using a high-end graphics monitor. But what I've done here is I've loaded in here the color profile as calibrated for a Dell monitor, which is a reasonably high-end monitor, but not certainly the ultimate. And you can see that the Dell monitor profile here shows significantly more colors than Srgb color space. So when I said that it was designed for fairly low-end, lowest common denominator, $99 Aldi type monitors, you can see that even a relatively inexpensive color monitor can display colors vastly outside the Srgb color space. So let's just then have a look at how that compares with Adobe Rgb color space, and you'll see if I turn off Srgb now that the Dell profile pretty much covers most of the Adobe Rgb color space. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to convert the Adobe Rgb color space into a single color so that we can see the differences. And you'll see that yes, there are some colors in the Adobe Rgb color space that we can't display, which is where we can see the red colors poking through, but we can also see some colors on this monitor that are actually outside the Adobe Rgb color space. So it's pretty close to representing all of the Adobe Rgb colors. So when people talk to you about Srgb, really they're talking about the cheapest, nastiest, lowest quality type of device possible, and today most reasonable quality monitors and display devices can handle a much wider range of colors than Srgb. Now that we've had a bit of a look at color spaces and how we measure and define color, let's have a little bit of a further look at how our cameras record a color image using our digital sensors. And the thing that we will look at firstly is the most common form of digital sensor, and that's what's called a Bayer arrangement, which uses a combination of red, blue and green filters over the individual pixels. And you'll see that if you look at the Bayer sensor carefully, you'll see that there's twice as many green sensors as there are red or blue. And that's because human vision is predominantly sensitive to green colors. And what happens is when you press the shutter, your camera records, if it's recording a RAW file, or even if it's recording a JPEG, it's going to record that raw information based on each of the pixels recording one color only. And if we look at this and take a look at what we see when we have a look at the back of our camera, the temptation is to look at the image on the back of the camera and say, well, that's what I've captured. But actually this is not the image. This is a JPEG thumbnail that is generated automatically when you press the shutter. Even if you're recording a RAW file, it records a JPEG thumbnail, and especially when you look at the histogram on the back of the camera, you will often see that it's indicating overblown highlights, when in fact when you open it in your Lightroom or other RAW processing software, you'll see that it's actually not overblown at all. And that's because the JPEG thumbnail compresses the image information, and you're not seeing really what the image is entirely made up of. Now with your RAW file, you're probably going to be recording either a 12-bit or a 14-bit file. A 12-bit file has a potential of 4096 levels of tone between black and white for each channel, and likewise a 14-bit file has 16,384 possible levels of tone for each of the pixels or each of the channels. And at the moment, when the image is recorded as a raw file, you're actually not seeing a color image. This is just a bit of a simulation here, but each of the channels records luminosity values for each of those colored filters. And so you've got something like a red channel would be like this, the green channel would be something like this, and the blue channel would be something like this, bearing in mind that we're actually only recording luminosity values. And a good camera these days is possible to record something like 11 or 12 stops of brightness from the darkest to the brightest. So our cameras have an incredible range of sensitivities and ability to record information, but it's not until the image is imported into your computer and opened with some sort of raw processing software that you can actually see a viewable image. So we'll have a look at that now and see how we process these colors into making a viewable image. So once we've saved our raw file on our camera's memory card and then downloaded that onto the computer and imported it into Lightroom, we see for the first time a representation of the image based on a default setting. As you'll see here, all of the values are at 0, the white balance is as shot, nothing has been touched, and this is just the default view after the software has combined that information from those 3 separate color channels into a viewable image. And also bear in mind that because each pixel only records red, green or blue, that as part of this process the software assigns a value for red, green and blue to each pixel. So for the first time you're seeing a combined image, and this is where we start off from. This is by no means the finish of the process. This is just the default view so that we can see what we've done and then start to process the image. And here is the image after we've carried out some adjustments. As you can see, we've moved the sliders around to create a modified version of the image preview, and we'll also do things like adjusting some sharpening and so forth. But essentially the default image you see when it's imported is just the basic view for you to start doing your editing and processing. We do most of the work here because we are adjusting the parameters of the raw file as it's imported. Once we convert it to a pixel-based image and export it to Photoshop, we don't have quite as much flexibility in adjusting the image as we do here in the raw processing engine. So we now have an image on our screen that we can modify and adjust to suit our preferences based on the raw image data. But before we move on from here, we need to look at a couple of important things. And the first thing is how we translate our raw file into a readable file in Photoshop. And we need to be able to tell Lightroom how to open the file in Photoshop. So we do that by going into Edit, Preferences, File Handling in the external editing, and we have a choice here. We want to either record it as a TIFF or a Photoshop file, and we want to designate the color space at this point because up until now we're working with a raw file. There is no particular color space tag to it, but when we're going to take it to Photoshop we want to make it a ProPhoto RGB file, and when working with ProPhoto we want to make sure that we're working with a 16-bit file to give us the maximum range of colors and tonal steps. And the resolution is not really important at this stage. However, if you are a printer and you are going to print this file without any further cropping, you should set the resolution here to save you having to re-sample the image later on. And if you're working with an Epson printer, you want 360 pixels per inch as your printing resolution, and if you're working with a Canon printer you want 300 pixels per inch as your print resolution. So when you export the file from Lightroom to Photoshop, such as we click right mouse click and go edit into Adobe Photoshop, it will export with those settings, and once you save the file from Photoshop, it will be saved as a TIFF or a Photoshop file. And now that we're looking at an image on screen, we also need to look at how we adjust the colors that we're seeing on our monitor. We're going to have a quick look at that next. When we're viewing our images on a monitor, we need to be sure that what we're seeing is the most accurate color possible. And there are two standards for viewing and editing images. The most important one is the standard for image editing, and that is an ISO standard, ISO 3664. The essential pieces of information to remember are that we work with 6500 degrees Kelvin as the color temperature, which is the most commonly used figure for daylight in the middle of the day. And we have a brightness range of 80 to 100 candelas and a gamma of 2.2. Now, most monitor profiling software will probably want you to have the monitor set at a brighter level, but 80 to 100 candelas is actually more accurate, particularly if we are going to view your image with a purpose of printing it at the end. And the second standard we have is the ISO 12646 for printing, and you'll see here that we have a different color temperature, 5000 degrees Kelvin, and that most closely matches your typical high quality art paper that is a neutral white, and that is a warmer tone than the 6500 degrees Kelvin, which is actually quite blue when you look at it in comparison. And again, we work with 80 candelas as the brightness level, and that equates as close as we can to the brightness level of paper. So those are the two standards we need to make sure that we follow, and with a monitor you need to profile that, and ideally have two profiles set up, one for editing your images and a second one for preparing for printing. Now that we've had a look at how we measure color, how we define color, how we use color, and how we calibrate our monitors so we can actually see accurate color, in the next video we're going to have a look at how we can use these tools to create images that really stand out. So we can take an image like this and turn it into this, or an image like this and turn it into this, using the tools with working with color in particular, or indeed this early morning shot to something more like this. So stay tuned for the next video, and we'll get into some nitty-gritty about working with color to make it work for you with your images.